Today, we're diving headfirst into one of the Bible's most intense chapters. It's an ancient text that asks a really tough question, a question that cuts right to the bone. Where does your ultimate loyalty really lie?
Seriously, just take a second and think about that. What is your non-negotiable? For a lot of us, it's probably something like family or our own integrity, right? It's that line in the sand you just won't cross. Well, this idea of absolute, 100% unshakable loyalty, that is the explosive core of the chapter we're unpacking today, Deuteronomy 13.
You know, scholars often call this chapter the test of loyalty. And for good reason. It lays out these intense scenarios that are specifically designed to find out where your allegiance truly is. And believe me, the stakes could not be higher. It pushes the whole idea of faithfulness to some pretty shocking limits. So the text gives us 3 tests, and each one gets more intense. First, imagine a prophet who performs actual miracles. Like, their signs and wonders really come true. But then they use that power to say, hey, let's go worship these other gods. Then it gets super personal. Your own brother, your son or daughter, even your spouse pulls you aside and secretly tries to get you to abandon your faith. And finally, the third scenario. An entire city, the whole community, decides to turn its back on its beliefs and go in a different direction.
Wow, the language here is just so raw and jarring, isn't it? This isn't about having a disagreement or blocking someone on social media. The text commands the most extreme punishment possible, even if it's for someone you love dearly. It says you can't show pity, you can't offer mercy, and you absolutely cannot hide what they've done. It frames loyalty to God as this absolute that has to trump even our most sacred human connections. Now, for that third scenario, the rebellious city, the text introduces this really difficult concept called herem. It basically means complete and total destruction. Everything and everyone is to be wiped out. And get this, all the city's wealth, all its stuff, has to be piled up and burned as a sacrifice. Now, the key point here, and it's a really important one, is that this was not about looting or getting rich. It was a theological act, almost like a surgical procedure to remove a spiritual cancer from the nation. You couldn't let any of that accursed thing stick to your hands.
And that, of course, brings us to the massive question that's probably on your mind right now. Why? Why on earth is the response so severe, so absolute, so violent? Well, to even begin to get our heads around that, we have to understand the world this text comes from.
So here's the deal. Ancient Israel was what you'd call a theocracy. This means God wasn't just some distant deity you worshipped. He was the literal, actual king of the nation. And in that kind of system, worshiping another god wasn't just a personal spiritual choice. No, it was an act of political rebellion. It was high treason against the sovereign. And in that world, treason was met with the ultimate penalty. Okay, so what happens to this ancient, incredibly harsh law? Does it just go away? Well, not exactly. The core principle, this idea of absolute loyalty, it doesn't vanish in the New Testament. Instead, it gets transformed. The method changes completely, shifting from swords to words, from physical punishment to a spiritual reality. Let's take a look at how that happened.
And the shift is pretty profound. So instead of stoning a false prophet, the New Testament calls for spiritual discernment, the ability to test what you're hearing and reject false teaching. Instead of burning a rebellious city, you get the idea of church discipline, a way for the community to maintain its spiritual integrity. And instead of physically removing a person, you have excommunication, what the Apostle Paul literally calls driving out the wicked person from the community. See? The principle of loyalty is still there, but the application becomes spiritual, not physical.
And then boom, Jesus himself says this, and it echoes the deepest, most difficult challenge of Deuteronomy 13. He isn't getting rid of the principle of ultimate allegiance. He's centering it on himself. That shocking demand for a loyalty that's even greater than your love for your own parents, it's transferred directly from God in the Old Testament to Jesus in the New. The test continues.
So how do we make sense of a chapter like this today? Well, modern theology gives us a couple of different ways to look at it. We're going to check out 2 of the main approaches, the evangelical and the liberal interpretations. And it's really not about a fight between the two. It's more about how different starting points can lead you to very different conclusions.
Okay, let's break this down. An evangelical approach typically starts with the Bible as God's direct word, with principles that are timeless. So the punishment, as harsh as it sounds to us, is seen as a necessary measure against treason within that specific theocratic context. On the other hand, a liberal interpretation often sees the text as powerful human literature from a particular time, maybe a political reform in the 7th century BCE that used extreme language for social control. From this view, the New Testament is a moral break from this kind of violence, not a spiritual continuation of the principle. It really all depends on your starting point.
All right, this has been a fascinating deep dive into history and theology, right? But what in the world does a 3,000-year-old law about stoning people have to do with you and me today? Well, the core idea, this test of loyalty and the danger of idolatry, it's actually more relevant than you might think. It's just that the other gods we face look a little different these days.
The other gods vying for our ultimate allegiance today probably aren't statues. They're powerful ideas, systems, and ambitions. Think about the relentless pursuit of financial security, or climbing the career ladder no matter who you step on. Think about political ideologies that demand your total unquestioning loyalty, or the drive for profit above all else. Any of these things can become the ultimate thing in our lives, our real non-negotiable.
Let's make this super practical. In the world of finance, what might this look like? Well, applying the principle of Deuteronomy 13 could mean making a conscious choice to not profit from industries that you know are exploitative or destructive. It's a modern version of that ancient command, don't let the accursed thing, the profit that comes from destruction, stick to your hands.
Or how about in the legal world? The text says, "Nor shall you conceal him." For a lawyer, that principle might translate into a deep commitment to real justice over just cleverly exploiting loopholes for a client you know is doing harm. It's about refusing to conceal wrongdoing just for a paycheck or a win.
And that brings us right back to where we started. This ancient, shocking, and difficult text forces us to turn the mirror on ourselves. We live in a world that is constantly screaming at us to compromise, to bend, to serve a dozen different masters. So the question for us is, what is our non-negotiable? What or who gets our ultimate allegiance? That is the timeless, enduring test of Deuteronomy 13.